Audrey Moody, graduate of the class of 1988, will introduce our speaker, and we will see this celebrity in person, in the person of Anthea Butler. Reverend Moody.
Good morning. I have this wonderful opportunity to introduce our speaker, our lecturer this morning. I'm certainly not going to read the bio that you have in front of you. I will say the following. I don't know if she recalls, but I first met Dr. Butler several years ago at the annual Holy Convocation of the Church of God in Christ. We were in Memphis, Tennessee, in a crowded room in the Marriott Hotel when her book was first introduced. And she proceeded to lecture us as women in the Church of God in Christ on being women in the Church of God in Christ. And I'm sure that her lecture today will be of the same quality and the same intensity, because that's who she is. I will say also, according to Dr. Katie Day, that Dr. Butler tweets more than Donald Trump. That's what Dr. Day says. Amen. All right, all right. Okay, we'll look at the numbers. Amen. All right. I'm looking forward to this lecture this morning, aren't you? And so without further ado, let's stand and receive our lecturer for this morning, Dr. Anthea Butler. May I hug you?
I can get her. I'm going to That's funny. If I tweeted as much as Donald Trump, I wouldn't even be here right now. I'd be out in the car tweeting. Y'all know this to be true. Don't let people lie on me like that. Thank you. Thanks for waiting on me this morning. I hope this is going to be worth it to you. I'm going to make an observation before I get started. I have gray hair, okay? I grayed very early. And I'm looking around the crowd right now, and I can see that you are the people who need to hear what I have to say today, because this is important. And it is going to change the way that we think about social action and church, because we're in the midst of a sea change. And I think that it's very difficult for churches and seminaries sometimes to understand what that is going to mean, and what that means for you in ministry, what it means for us as a nation, because we are in perilous times. And these perilous times are not for the faint of heart. They are for people who are ready. They are for people who are willing to hit the streets. Some of us, like me, can't hit the streets all the time because we got bad knees. Okay, well, and you know that this is the case. But when we see young people out in the streets today, what do we think about them? How do we talk about them? What do we think is happening right now? And how is that affecting us in not just churches, but in social action around the country? And I've titled this Millennial Social Justice and the Future of Religious Advocacy in America, because perhaps religious advocacy is not for those who we think it is, but it's going to be for a younger generation of people. You probably hear a lot of jokes about millennials. People say things about millennials like, oh, well, basically, you know, they like avocado toast, so they can't pay their loans, and they're not going to be able to do things. But I would submit to you that millennials are going to be more engaged in social action than we are, because they know that they aren't going to have the money to get through it. Prosperity gospel is not going to help them. Amen? It is not going to be the sense in which they will be able to go forward in the ways that you do, with a nice house and a nice car, and knowing that they have a retirement fund. They are going to be the greeters at Walmart. They are going to be the ones without insurance. They are the ones that don't have sufficient funds, that if they are able to do something, and if something happens to them, a major illness, loss of a job, they don't have anything to fall back on. And our churches today don't have enough money to sustain people when they are in need. And I'm not going to get an amen on this, because I'm about to tell you some scary stuff. But I wanted to start today with a picture of the school kids in Florida, because I think they are, A, the future, and B, they are tired of the mess. Tomorrow, lots of kids are going to walk out of school at 10 o'clock in the morning. They are going to walk out because they are tired of gun violence. But the other thing that they should be tired of is the silence from the churches. The churches who have not spoken out. And I know that there are some, especially here in Philadelphia, who have to speak out about it because we have kids dying of gun violence right here in Philadelphia. But the fact of the matter is the Christian church as a whole in America will not speak out. Maybe it's because the evangelicals are in the pocket of Donald Trump. Maybe it's because they like power more than they like purity. Maybe it's because they like mammon more than they love God. Whatever it is, this is not providing something that young people want to be involved with. This is not showing them something that maybe they should be in the church. And so while my talk today is going to focus in on African American millennials, I really want you to think about this in a broader way, to think about it in terms of this affecting everyone. Because the last time I was here, as you reminded me, Quentin, we talked about the black church, was the black church dead? It's really on life support right now, it's in a coma. Now, I know y'all don't want to hear that, well, because you shout every Sunday, you happy, and all of that. But the fact of the matter is, you don't have any of these kids in your churches. And this is a problem. The chart you see in front of you is from the Pew Forum on Black Millennials. This is from a couple of years ago. This is belief in God among younger millennials who identify as black. You will see that 72% of them believe in God, absolutely certain. 18% believe in God, fairly certain. 4% believe in God, not at all too certain. We got 4% that don't believe in God. And kind of a negative 1% that says, I believe in God, don't know. And then don't know if they believe in God or not, okay? So this is a pretty high number, right? This would show that millennials are open to thinking about spirituality. They are open to thinking about God. But they are not thinking about God the same ways that you are, okay? So you have to remember one thing when we get started with this, is that they are not looking at leadership in churches the same way that you look at leadership in churches. They are thinking about, how can I make a connection with God on my own? Can I make it individual? Is it something that speaks to me? Am I listening to Chance the Rapper and he's giving me something that is feeding me that day instead of what a preacher's going to tell me for 3 hours on a Sunday morning while he hollering for an offering? Okay? So already you are set up with an issue. The numbers are telling you something, but let's go forward because this is a bigger issue. And this is the biggest issue for black churches. Black millennials and church attendance. You notice these numbers just really went down. 42% go at least once a week. 35% go once or twice a monthly or a few times a year. 23% say seldom and never. And every 1% say don't know, and that means I probably ain't never been in church anyway. Don't care. That's just a place on the corner that maybe sometime Pookie and me hang out at. Okay? Now, this is a big number. That's a big drop. You're losing 30% of the people that said they believed in God. They are not in church. Why are they not there? Why are they not there? You all have heard this line before. Why don't we have young people in the church? How can we get young people within the church or whatever? The church is not social media, y'all. You joking about me being on Twitter, but let me tell you something. Where the black church is right now for millennials is Twitter and Facebook. That is where they are connected. That is where they are finding the connections that they need and the spirituality that they need. So I'm going to start off by telling you a story that's going to feed into my topic for today. In 2014, in August, I was in London, England, and I had gotten back from a nice evening out, turned on my laptop to see the things that were happening in Ferguson, Missouri. It was the shooting of Mike Brown. And people were all over Twitter talking about this. What is happening? Where is God? How come this is happening? Why are they leaving his body out in the street like this? That was the place where people began to make the connections. They began to make the connections because it was the place that they could lament. And even earlier than that, with the death of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman, this was the place that young millennials went to lament. They didn't go to church. They didn't go up to hear a sermon that they couldn't talk back to. They talked to each other on social media. And so the work that I've been doing in the last year and a half to 2 years on a project about religion and public life that's funded by the Luce Foundation has been about what is Black Twitter? How is Black Twitter connecting not just African American women, but African Americans totally in a spiritual space? What is it doing that other spaces are not doing? Now, I'm not advocating that each one of you need to go get on Twitter. What I need you to understand is that this is a different space. This is not a physical space that is held within four walls, that has a liturgy, that has a way of which we do things, and a person up front talking to everybody in the back. It is a space where everyone can have these questions and ask those questions answered. It is also a space in which the immediacy of life can be addressed. When Mike Brown died and that shooting happened, that went everywhere. It wasn't a church day. It wasn't a Sunday. You can't wait until you get to Sunday to deal with the life that we have at this moment in this nation. Amen. It happens right now. And how do you reach millennials that are connected in ways that you have not been? So what I want to do is just kind of go through this morning and talk a little bit about this history, because it's a very different history than what you're thinking about in terms of civil rights. And I'm going to kind of contrast what young millennials are doing vis-a-vis something else that's happening right now, which is William Barber's Poor People's Campaign, which is a recapitulation of what Martin Luther King did right before he passed away, that started in December of 1967. Here is the point of my talk today. My point of this talk today is that you need to retrench for where we are right now. What you have been doing will not work anymore. You know this, and I know your president is going to say, oh, please don't say this out loud because this is really true, but seminaries are not making it anymore because people aren't coming. I'm so glad to see 3 students who are doing well here. That's great. I'm a seminary student myself. But I need to tell you that it's times of trouble for everyone. And we now have to figure out how are we going to change this so that people will want to come to the doors through here, but also feel relevant to the outside world. And for those of us who are a little bit older, like you and I and all the, some of you out here, right? We might have to get out of the way, but we also need to understand why we're getting out of the way. We also need to understand why we need to fund these things, why we need to pay attention to them, why we don't need to, how shall I say this gently, chastise those who don't believe the same way we do. And that's the harder part. So let me start to talk about this with the death of Trayvon Martin and the Dream Defenders, which was something that happened in Florida and was really impressive because people don't usually talk about them very much, but I want to talk about this. If you notice this first clip up here that says, I am human. This is very much reminiscent of one of the signs that was up during the garbage strike in Memphis, Tennessee in 67, 68. If you remember, you can remember those pictures that says, I am a man. Dream Defenders who used I am a human. The Dream Defenders started right after the death of Trayvon Martin. They wanted to advocate for several things. One was to make sure that guns would be, some kind of laws would be strict about stand your ground. Because stand your ground was a horrible case in Florida in which people are just able to shoot you at will and say, I felt threatened. I felt as though I could have something wrong. They tried to implore the governor to do different things. And as you can see, there's 2 pictures here. One of these is from 2012. So they even started off long before Black Lives Matter marching. They were protesting a debate being held in Florida between Obama and Mitt Romney during that time period. Now, the Dream Defenders were made up of young people who had decided that they would go in and sit in on the state capitol of Florida. And they sat in and actually had a sit-in for several days. We look at what these kids are doing right now with the shootings in Florida, and we think, wow, that's really great. But back in 2012, this was already happening. But the Dream Defenders didn't get the same kind of press like everybody else. Well, they didn't get the same kind of press because look at who they are. They're African Americans. That's the first thing. The second thing they didn't get the same kind of press is because they did not do the same kinds of sort of moral kinds of things that a church person would do. In other words, to make the kind of same moral appeals. They made moral appeals based on humanistic ideals. They weren't necessarily religious ideals. And so when we see these things, how do we respond as religious people, as churches, as seminaries, to groups like this? And this is going to be my big question. Now, here's the second thing that happened in Ferguson. And I'm going to show a little clip here for a second. This is something that really caught my eye right at the beginning of everything that happened in Ferguson, because I knew that it meant that the old days were gone. Hopefully everybody can hear this.
Hey, Jesse Jackson, how you doing?
Off the lot, sir. Come on, say hi and let's go.
Are you here to support us? You are? You've been watching all day long? We haven't seen you watching all day long. We haven't seen you. Hey, are you going to pay the bond of those brothers that's been locked up? You've been with the Brown family all day? What about the brother that filmed the Eric Garner murder? Are you going to post his bond?
Hey, you marching today with us, or you just gonna sit in the car?
Because we haven't seen you marching at all, Jesse.
You march, or you gonna sit in the
We ain't
car?
seen you. When you gonna stop selling us out, Jesse? We don't want you here in St. Louis. When you gonna stop selling us out, Jesse? No, ain't no wait a minute, brother. This is real. We activists out here. We activists out here, brother. This is real. We don't want you here. You're not a leader. You're not a leader. We don't want you here, brother. Matter of fact, you're not even a brother. You could keep moving and get the brothers out of jail. That's what you could do.
Well, this is not what we're used to hearing, right? Why? Why did this happen? Part of it has a lot to do with the perception of civil rights leaders like Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and others. That perception from millennials is this: you are making money off of these things, and you are not doing what you should be in terms of helping us as activists. You heard what he said. You're not out here in the streets. Where are you? Now, that does not mean that pastors were not in the streets. There were plenty of pastors in the streets at Ferguson. But what he objected to was this leadership that comes in from the outside and pretends that it's going to take over what people have already been doing every day. This is one of the biggest critiques I think millennials have in most of these social movements that are going on for justice right now, is that outside leaders are not good enough anymore. If you subscribed to an old paradigm of Martin Luther King leading the march, and we already know, if you know any civil rights history, that that was not just the case. King was a figure, but there are thousands of people who were involved in the civil rights movement. If you subscribe to that, then you will understand the frustration of millennials who are out in the streets. Their frustration is that they are not being listened to, first of all. Secondarily, they do not see religious leadership that will come in and do the kinds of things that they need to do in order to help them figure out how to combat police injustices, violence, whatever the situation might be. And so this critique was very sharp in Ferguson. Now, it doesn't mean that things didn't happen in Ferguson. It just meant that it was a moment for me to realize that something else was happening. Now, this is from a clergy march in Ferguson in 2014. You notice in the front, this is Reverend Oseko Sefu, who is basically, had been arrested for this. Cornel West is there. You can see some other figures in the background. This was a clergy march that was led from outsiders, but there were many other people involved. They got the community involved. They did this. If we think about what happened in Charleston just last August, same thing. Except the clergy in Charleston, that was an even smaller number of people. A lot more of those people were out there because they wanted to fight against the white supremacists that came out. And so how do we begin to think about what it means for clergy and millennials to act together? What is it that needs to be done? I submit the first thing that needs to happen is we need to have an understanding that millennials are acting in a different way than clergy are acting when they show up at an event. Millennials are responding to an immediate need. They are responding to an immediate threat of violence. It is not something that is, particularly thought out. It is, we are going to fight this particular situation that is a fire situation. It's not, we're not going to plan logistically. We're not doing all this stuff. We need to show up and be ready to do what we need to do, okay? And so in these kinds of situations, I think the first thing for clergy to understand is that the models are different. The models are different in terms of how you think about long-term versus the short-term. In the short term, what is important for millennials is that we need to show ourselves out there to protest this violence immediately. It is not, though, that they don't plan. They do plan. They just don't plan the same way you do, okay? Second, they're not going to want to go to a long church service and hear no preaching about this. They are in the street. It is about activism. Activism has a root word, active. Active does not mean sitting. Active means organizing. And so if you think that you want to be involved with millennials, you need to be active and active in organizing. You can't simply just talk at people and say you don't have a plan. One of the interesting things about comparing these kinds of movements, and I'm going to talk about Black Lives Matter in a minute, is that when Black Lives Matter got started, everybody didn't think that they had a plan, but they had a platform. They had a platform. They were organized. They knew exactly what they wanted to do, and they organized in the face after the George Zimmerman acquittal, okay? And so since then, they have been very forward. What have I heard from black church leaders? Well, you know, they're not organized. They don't know what they want to do. That's not the case at all. This is organization, but it's organization in a different way. It's organization that demands that you are seen, demands that you get press, demands that the normal people who are used to speaking for these things all the time do not speak out. So in other words, when we start to think about Black Lives Matter in the wake of Ferguson and other places, then we have to understand it not just as an organization that just responds to, immediate situations, but an organization that has a longitudinal purpose. And that longitudinal purpose is very different than these kinds of purposes that people had in the civil rights movement in terms of we want to get legislation done and everything else. Legislation is fine, but that is for another group of people to do. This is not what millennials are going to do. They are disengaged from this system. They don't have money to run for office. They should be. We should be backing them. But running for office is not their end game. And if we understand that, we'll understand what's going on. Here's another picture from Black Youth Project 100, another group from 2015 in New Orleans. They were also fighting against police violence there in New Orleans. And one of the things that has been interesting about this is, again, they have not gotten the kind of press that Black Lives Matter has received. Doing the same kinds of things, doing very important advocacy work with groups all around the United States and in Canada. But we don't see this very well because if you look for this every day on your normal newscast, it's not there. It's on social media. It's in places in their own publications, in their websites. They even are organized to tell you how do you come out to think about what you're doing when you're out in the streets. How do you protect yourself? If you're going to be out in Charlottesville, how do you protect yourself against white supremacists that are out there with weapons? How do you write your telephone number or something on there of a lawyer on your arm so you have somebody to call when you get arrested? Who's going to pay your bail money? All of this is organization, just like in the civil rights movement, but we tend to think of them as not being organized, again, because they're millennials. Now, let me say a couple of things before I do a little switch and talk about William Barber. The issue then for us is twofold. One is, I believe, that churches need to figure out a way to tap into how they can assist these organizations. Organizations like Black Lives Matter, Black Youth Project, Dream Defenders, and all these others need financial and physical support from people who already have things. So in other words, if you got a church, open it up. Make sure that somebody can meet there. Can you provide food? Can you provide clothing? What can you provide in terms of a big event? We have not had a big event happen here in Philadelphia. We've had police shootings, but I'm telling you, we're just always one step away from something really bad happening here. We have shootings every day. How is it that we don't have the same kind of groups out in the streets here in Philadelphia every day? Part of it is about A, infrastructure, and B, how do we support them when they do come out? All right? Now, I want to contrast this just a little bit with Moral Mondays and William Barber, because I think this is also important, but for a different reason altogether. Now, I will tell you that if you look at this, this is from the Moral Mondays campaign that they did in New York, where they were supporting teachers about 3 years ago. Moral Mondays started off in North Carolina with Reverend Dr. William Barber, who actually said, we are tired of the kinds of laws that the Republicans that were putting in office in the state were putting into place that were hobbling people in North Carolina, taking away Medicare and all kinds of other things. And so they started meeting on Mondays and getting arrested. You will notice something about this crowd. Not many millennials, right? They all look like some of us here in the audience, okay? This is what I would call more traditional or religious organizing. You have a reverend or a pastor in the front, stole on. I really love William Barber. I feel like he's got a lot of things to say. But this is traditional organizing, okay? Now, traditional organizing gets something very different. You get, some play. So not a lot of people even knew about Moral Mondays until it had been a year in, basically, because it was a Southern kind of thing. It didn't get a lot of press. MSNBC covered it a little bit. It did not move into other churches. You would think that something that said Moral Mondays could go across denominationally and move into some different churches, and this would be a way to counteract moral issues. Didn't happen that way. I promise you, if this had been conservative Christians, they would have taken this up and it ran with it. What's wrong with the liberals? Not very organized, right? So here's the thing. This has been a great campaign, but now this campaign has shifted, and now it's called the Poor People's Campaign. And that is to evoke Martin Luther King. But my question about all of this has brought up something, and you're talking to somebody who teaches King, brings up some painful things for me. And one of the painful things it brings up for me is that nobody even remembers hardly what the Poor People's Campaign is unless you took a class. That's number one. Number two is that this campaign, in the face of a presidency who is surrounded by prosperity gospel people, the last thing anybody wants to talk about is being poor. Because they're ashamed of it. You can laugh, it's the truth. It's true, because being poor now is not something to be looked at as something that is great. Being poor now is something that is looked upon as being ashamed. You should be ashamed of it because that means you are not blessed by God. And we have a whole administration full of people right now who don't even want to pay attention to what poverty is. And the people who are poor want to be Trump. And so they're not even listening to what the great things that Reverend Barber has to say about poverty and how they're getting messed up by everybody around them that they voted for. Because basically, they're ashamed. And so one of the things I would ask us to think about today, and what I want to think about, is that how do we try to bring both of these things together? Because some of the things in Reverend Barber's campaign are really excellent. You see the signs behind voter suppression. Voter suppression has been a very big thing. This is something that churches should have been fighting against. In Alabama, with the recent election for senator that was there, who worked that out? There were a network of churches that made sure that people got to the polls. It was the old-fashioned stuff, y'all. Okay? There was one woman who drove around in her car and picked up people and took them to the polls. Okay? That was the old-fashioned stuff, but it went along with new things like social media. How do we begin to put both of these things together? How are we supposed to think about what we are doing, and how can we take the organizational ideas of millennials and take that into the future? So let me close by just saying a couple of things and some thoughts, and then I'm happy to answer some questions or anything that you have. One thing I think is important about this is that we need to begin to really start to look at what millennials are doing in these movements like Dream Defenders, Black Lives Matter, Black Youth Project. If we do not try to support these at this time, these things will collapse. They will collapse because they don't have enough funding, or they will collapse because people get older and they have to take care of themselves. We will reach a crisis in this country. Those of us who have enough money to be able to take care of ourselves when we retire versus these millennials who are not going to have the same kind of funding. They will not have these things. The erosions that are happening right now in DC and statewide are crisis situations. This is not just about, we have to go up for every bit of police violence or everything else. The fact that the financial grounding is broken is going to break everything you have right now. It is going to break your churches. It's going to break your seminaries. And if we don't start to think about these things holistically together, that's important. That's number one. Number two, don't expect religion or faith or belief to be the same way that it used to be. If you need to be in church, you need to do this, you need to do that. That is falling on deaf ears right now because nobody cares. I hate to tell you that. I'm a churchgoer. I love church. I love preaching just like everybody else. But I need to tell you that the students that I deal with every day down here at Penn who are very privileged and are ready to do whatever they want to do in the world are very worried about their futures. The last thing they are thinking about is where I'm going to be on Sunday. They're trying to think about, am I going to have money left over when I get out of this expensive 4-year institution? And will I be able to have a job, or do I need to continue to professionalize myself until I have so much debt I'm paying for the debt when I get out? Well, and you have to see this as part of a whole. We can't just see it as part of something that millennials are just lazy or they eat too much avocado toast. I'm so sick of the avocado toast analogy about millennials. It makes me sick. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then you're probably not on social media, and that's good. But it doesn't work anymore. Millennials have real concerns. They are the ones who are calling out the real fissures in our society. And until we begin to listen to them, we're not going to really get a sense in our comfortable spaces where we are with nice jobs and nice positions and houses and all of that to understand what it really means. The third thing, and I think one of the more important things that we have to do, is we need to think about the places we need to become active. If you don't know millennial, that's a problem, because you've already aged out of anything that means activism. And you should never age out of activism as far as I'm concerned, because we're not in a time period where we can afford to remain silent. We are not in a time that we can afford to ignore the kinds of things that are going on in the world right now. This is hitting our doorsteps as we speak. All around you right now, people are being herded up by ICE. This is the next movement that needs to happen. A movement that fights for immigration. I have DACA kids in my classroom right now who don't know what next thing is going to happen to them, who want to plan for a future that they don't know that they're going to have. This is where things are going. These kids have been out there in front of the White House, in front of the Capitol and everything else, and I'm not seeing many churches speaking out about this because you don't think you have anybody like that, but I need to tell you some black DACA kids too, okay? I have them. And we need to begin to pay attention for all that. That means time's up, and I'm about to close in a minute. That means we've got to pay attention to all of these movements, whether it's millennials on one side or it's the traditional kinds of movements that William Barber is posting on the other side. This is a moment for us to come together. How are we going to come together? Can we let go of some of the ways that we've thought about organizing to embrace something different? Because the times are calling for something different. We have an urgency, the fierce urgency of now. And it's not just what King said back then, because if you think we're done, we haven't even started yet. How will we start? And one of the ways that we can start is to begin to watch what millennials are doing, because they, not us, are what's going to lead us into a better future. Thank you.
We have 8 minutes for Q&A.
Woo.
Wow.
I know y'all got lots of questions.
So, hold on. I need some help. 2 students, come, take a mic from me. Look at them.
That's so great.
I love these 2. These are our 2 representatives on Utica, our student reps, Emmanuel and Sharif. If you'll take either side. Okay.
Dr. Butler, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm a former high school teacher from Vermont, an ostensibly liberal state, the home of Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
And I have 2 millennial children and many millennial colleagues who find the church to be very suspect, actually the oppressor. And they tolerate me. They think he's cool, but that's his hobby. Could you help me thinking about that, and saying that the life of God and the church is a connection? Because frankly, in Vermont, most liberals are just too cool for church.
Yeah, they really are. Unfortunately, probably cows are too. But you know what I'm talking about, because there's probably a lot of cow tipping up there. I'm from Texas. On a serious note, though, you know what I find? I really do find that to take the language outside of church and to, let's talk about some basics. And I don't mean in a kind of scriptural way, but to take the tenets of the gospel and begin to talk about them. I mean, I think about John 4 as a way to talk about what the things Jesus did. I came to heal the brokenhearted. I came to bind up wounds, right? Talking about Jesus is a way to get out of all the rest of the stuff. Because Jesus would be out there with these people right now. He'd be out there with the millennials. He'd have gotten arrested. He did get arrested, right? And beat up, all that stuff. Ain't nobody came to pay his bail, right? So, this is where we tend, as church people, we want to say, we want to talk about scriptures, that you should come to church because it's going to feed you, whatever. think about the ways that you can provide spiritual solace and strengthening outside of that context. Because I think if you try to get them into the building, getting people into the building now is a really tough prospect. They have to be willing to come into the building. Or if they're coming into the building, it has to be for something other than a service, right? And so I think if you can start to think about ways to talk about them like that, at least that's the way I try to do it, is if I'm going to talk about this, let me talk about it in a way that has life to it instead of death, right? Because for some people, sitting in a pew is death. And let's be honest, I'm part of a church that has a big sexual abuse problem. Okay, how do you get people back in the church? I mean, one of the things, and that somebody was watching Pope Francis, so I can talk about him for a minute, because it's 5 years today that he came in. One of the things I think has been refreshing about Pope Francis is that he's speaking to people where they are. He's not saying you need to go and do your Sunday obligation. Of course, anybody who's Catholic knows you're supposed to go to Mass every Sunday. But that's not what he's saying to people. He's trying to talk to people where they are, to talk about the environment, to talk about, finances, to talk about the ways in which immigration is crushing people and how you need to welcome the stranger. All of that is biblical principles. But we have to find a way to talk about that now that has more life to it, instead of just simply trying to drag people into the buildings we have.
Dr. Butler, I'm wondering if you can speak to points of intersectionality. I know Asa Khalif talks a lot about the most endangered person in Philadelphia is Black and queer.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear your points on that, and if you've dialogued with Asa Khalif.
I have not dialogued with Asa Khalif, but I will say this. That's a very important point of intersectionality, because if we and it's part of the reason why people won't come to church in the first place. Let's be real. I mean, we didn't even talk about, just talk about straight sex for a minute. Let's not even talk about anything else. I mean, if you just hear every Sunday that you ain't supposed to sleep with nobody, then that's boring. Okay? I mean, it simply is. I'm sorry. And I'm going to tell it to you like I said to the AMEs, that I'm probably never going to get back invited again. I like Reverend Mark a lot. But, when everybody got killed in Charleston, I was in a thing in Mother Bethel, and I use this as an example. And basically, somebody got up there and started, well, I was going to talk about this, but let me talk about homosexuality, because Vashti McKenzie had been up. And, okay, and I know people watching this live, hey, I'm about to go over there, okay? And I said to them, if you are more worried about what people are putting into somebody's body than somebody killing the human body, you have a problem. That's my theology about sexuality. If you care more about what's going into a body than the body being killed, you are not of God. I'm sorry, but if my personal belief is that God created you to be who you are, trans, queer, whoever you are, this is not something that is a negotiable. And so for many people, this means that we ain't never inviting her to my church again. That's cool. It's okay. I need to live where I live. And this is where I'm living. This is the hill I will die on. But if this does not happen, this is why people don't want to come. And this is part of the struggle right now. We don't understand all these bathroom laws and all the craziness that's happening, all the reproductive crushing that's happening to women in states like my home state of Texas. All of this stuff is being done by religious people. Okay? They are part of the complex of pain and suffering. Okay? So there's no mistake that millennials look at this and go, I don't have nothing to do with y'all. Why would I want to? Right? If you're going to try to get millennials, quit talking about sex. Quit talking about it. I mean, because I'm not saying to quit talking about it in the ways in which you don't talk about sex. What I'm saying is quit talking about it as though it's something to be ashamed of. Quit trying to shame people into doing something that's not right. And so for those, it's too much. We've had trans murders here in this town. We've had all kinds of stuff. What churches are talking about this? I mean, I could count them on a hand. This is not right. And if you are in a church that talks about this stuff and you gay, get out. This is like get out. You are in a vortex. You have been bamboozled and whipped into thinking that you bad, and you're going to give these people your tithes and offerings that don't care if you die. I'm just saying, why do that?
Here's a question. the problem I'm seeing is that the connections between millennials who are white and privileged and the millennials who are African American and poor are not intersecting yet. They may be around the gun issue in some places, but tomorrow's walkout, there have been many advertisements and interviews of, not advertisements, but interviews of black students in Philadelphia who say, we're not walking out.
Yeah, because and you know why they're not, right?
So that's my question. How can we figure out a way? Can the church be a bridge? Did they help me with this?
I think we can. And one of the reasons why is the black students who don't want to walk out tomorrow, because they know they're going to catch hell. Right? The white students don't ever catch hell about nothing. They can sit out there and shoot off fireworks in the thing and they'll be like, oh, look at that, it's so cute. That's just youth, right? And black students sit up there and just even look at a firework, it's like, he's trying to bomb the school. Right? So here's what we have to deal with the racial difference. One of the ways that has to happen is this openness to say, I know that this is racism. One of the things I'm very frustrated right now with all these evangelicals lamenting about Donald Trump is that they won't say what the whole core thing is. Racism. Until you can own up to that, you can't own up to anything. And so that's the moment for young white millennials that you might be in contact with to talk to them about, you need to help because there's this racial issue that is happening that these black students can't do what you do because they're going to get hit just as better as you are. Because all the schools that they're going to apply to, whether that's Penn or somebody else who said, well, it's okay if you get expelled, we're going to take you anyway. For a black student, they'd be like, oh, you got expelled? I'm not looking at your application. These are the structural issues that young millennials need to understand, young white millennials. And for young black millennials, there has to be, and this is a hard thing to ask, because I have to talk about this all the time with students, is that you got to figure out who you can trust. Okay? Because there are some white people worth trusting, and there are some you should not trust as far as you can throw them. If you can throw them. Okay? I'm sorry, I'm just going to be honest about it. This is real deal. And this is the kind of thing that I think if we can just get this stuff out in open, because listen, if we got a president that's cussing out people and telling people that their mothers are SOBs and stuff, right, then we can talk about all this stuff. Nothing should be off the table anymore to talk about. There's none of this, niceties anymore. Let's just talk. Any other questions? Got time for one more? Well, I want to ask you all. Oh, we got one right here. Good. Perfect.
Thank you, Dr. Butler, for your comments today. I was one of the young clergy activists in that picture.
There you go.
And I'm nervous. From St. Louis.
Yeah.
From St. Louis. I got my hair cut right there where they were gathering. Went to that McDonald's many times. My mom and I did laundry at the laundry queen right there.
So you can speak on this better than I can even.
Well, no. But thank you for that. But I am nervous about the future of the church. I'm nervous about the church that is in the street and the church that is in the building, especially as one who was taking out a lot of that loan debt to professionalize myself, to do what I feel God has called me to do.
Yeah.
How do you see the church moving forward? I have some thoughts, but nothing conclusive.
I don't have any thoughts either. Well, I do have thoughts, but let me put it like this. The demographics are not working in the favor of the church. And the reason why I say that is because people are just unchurched. It used to be, I could say, AME, CME, Kojic, everybody knew what I was talking about. People look at me like, what you talking about? Because there's no knowledge of this anymore. There's no space for that. And you're being trained for something, and you're thinking, am I going to be able to look at myself 30 years from now, right, and see myself in a pulpit? You might not. But that doesn't mean you can't be doing what you need to be doing in the service of God. And so this is where you need to think about, and we all have to think about this, about what spaces there are. And what spaces can we be in? Is this in public policy? Is it in some other space, in law, in, civil service, wherever that is? I think part of our problem has been is that we think about this as being in a building, and we need to get out of thinking of it as being in a building. You can see what has happened here. We got lots of freestanding churches here in Philadelphia that are empty. Ain't nobody in them. The demographics have changed, whether that's black, white, they've just changed. And so we have to start to think about how is church going to be a holistic thing, whether that's about, we're providing services, it's schools, it's all this stuff, Or is it going to be this thing that we just think we're supposed to do on Sundays and have a nice pulpit and go to like convocations and stuff? Because, you know, it's not, I don't know that this is going to last. I mean, just, you know, I'll give it to you an example just in closing to just talk about it from an academic's perspective. Academics go to conferences every year. You know, we have big conferences, whether that's Society of Biblical Literature or AAR or whatever. People don't have the same kind of money to go like they used to have 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago was 2008 was a financial crash that crushed a lot of this stuff. That crushed churches too, but churches didn't think about that. Churches have been called on in this country to provide services where the government has cut services, right? And so we don't have people in the churches that can give the same kind of money anymore because their money ain't running right. So how are they going to be able to pay for a pastor and do pastor's anniversary and all that kind of stuff? I'm just saying, you got to have a big old church to get a pastor's anniversary now. You might be riding a pumpkin like Cinderella. Ain't no more cars. Ain't none of that stuff. You know, so if I'm you right now, I'm telling you to tool up to do a couple of things, not just one. Because if you think about the church just being 4 buildings and a steeple on the top, you know, like they used to play the little game when you're a kid, you ain't gonna make it. But, all right.
Can we give it to her again?
Thank you.